Dowsing and Archaeology. Part 1. By Guy Underwood. As this article is addressed primarily to dowsers, and as it deals with a supposed relationship between their art and one of an entirely dissimilar nature, it is desirable to say something about the latter. Many people take a dim view of archaeologists, alleging that they consist exclusively of old gentlemen engaged in interminable controversies, in which they contradict each other flatly on matters in which neither can prove his case, the weapons on both sides consisting entirely of suppositions. This is not entirely true. There are two kinds of archaeologists, the student and the field archaeologist. The field archaeologist does the work, and makes all the discoveries. The student sits at home in comfort and contradicts him. I am a field archaeologist. Archaeology is the study of antiquity. It is a fascinating occupation. It is too fascinating, and for the last 2 years I have done practically nothing else than dig, survey and record, and study in stuffy libraries. I would strongly urge others not to allow themselves to be enticed into taking any part in it. The first piece of prehistoric pottery they find, or the first bone discovered in a tumulus, which they will assume to be part of the anatomy of some long-forgotten hero, but which will more probably be goat or some other domestic animal, will infect them. All their well-earned leisure will then, like mine, be sacrificed to a pursuit in which whatever they may discover can never be of any practical use to anybody. My own entanglement in archaeology was involuntary. A few years ago I found, entirely by chance, a prehistoric site known as the Budbury Circle, in the town in which I live. The local council wished to build on it. I tried to persuade them to build elsewhere. Many archaeologists backed me up, local politicians joined in, and ultimately the site was built on. In the melee that ensued, I found myself the center of contesting interests in which any protagonist short of an adversary, or not daring to attack a more important one, seemed to aim a blow at me. I emerged with a thick skin and some knowledge of prehistory. Fortunately, or unfortunately, I knew of another interesting site, and since then have been a prey to archaeology. Archaeology is mostly concerned with those periods of time of which little or no written records exist, that is to say, the prehistoric periods. In this country, these periods are those preceding the Roman occupation. The only evidences available to the archaeologist in this country consist of a few implements, weapons, potsherds and bones, and the rough structures in which they are found. Any attempt, therefore, with such materials only, to reconstruct the history, religion, manners and customs of the peoples of vast unrecorded ages is far beyond our reach. All that is likely to be discovered consists of petty details, mere traces of man's existence, of little historical value. This does not seem to deter the archaeologist, but unless some wider approach is adopted, it would appear improbable that our knowledge of antiquity can be greatly increased. Some knowledge can, however, be obtained from comparative archaeology, owing to the affinity of the prehistoric cultures and religions of this country with those of other parts of prehistoric Europe. All appear to have had a common derivation from Egypt and Mesopotamia, whence they spread up the Danube and along the Mediterranean basin, ultimately reaching this country. One of the mysteries, which has inspired much erudite speculation among antiquaries, is that of the location, arrangement and design of the prehistoric stone circles, long barrows, and round barrows. They are usually referred to as sacred sites. As to location, there is no obvious visible factor common to all that will provide an explanation as to why they are placed where they are. Long barrows. These are enormous oval burial mounds, sometimes over 300 feet long. They are usually on heights, but sometimes not. The date of erection of these is usually placed as between 2500 and 1900 BC, that is to say, during the last half of the Neolithic, or Late Stone Age, period. They have the peculiarity that the larger end is, in the great majority of cases, directed towards the east. This orientation may vary from a few degrees east of north in one case to a few degrees east of south in another. The ancient peoples were quite capable of orienting these mounds precisely what then was the consideration so paramount as to lead them to vary their sacred orientation. Why also, if they were of so great importance as appears, are they not all sited in the most prominent positions? Stone circles. The dates of the stone circles are about the same as the long barrows, but some may have been built somewhat later, and there is evidence that others, for example Stonehenge, have been altered and partially redesigned at later dates. The sites of circles also vary in their heights. Most are high, but some, for instance Stanton Barrow, Avebury, and Longmeg, are in low-lying situations. Most stone circles have outlying stones, clearly related in some way to the circle, the significance of which is a complete mystery. At Stonehenge there are 2 station stones, lying northwest and southeast of the circle. Somewhat similar stones are found at Woodhenge, Stanton Drew, and many others. Round barrows. These are almost all of the Bronze Age, 1900 BC to 500 BC. They are found at all heights and are often found in groups forming straggling lines. Why? Attempts have been made to explain these peculiarities on astronomical grounds, or by alignments, but nothing appears to have carried conviction except in the minds of the propounders of the theories. It is clear that, having regard to the enormous labor of erecting these great monuments, they must have been regarded as of the highest importance. It follows that their locations are unlikely to have been haphazard or arbitrary, and that some cogent reason must have decided it. This reason must have formed an important integral part in the prehistoric religion. If that reason can be discovered, it would provide a far-reaching addition to our knowledge of prehistory. The object of this article is to submit facts which appear to have some bearing upon this. Archaeology is an art rather than a science. Its basic principles are conclusions seldom capable of complete proof. New ideas are not welcomed in it any more than in the other arts, and possibly less. In the great art of medicine all the most significant advances, antiseptics, vaccination, anesthetics, etc. were strenuously opposed, and sometimes not fully accepted until after the death of their discoverers, who were often subjected to misrepresentation and abuse. Nothing infuriates a little learning so much as greater knowledge. It will be seen, therefore, that anyone who ventures to put forward a new idea needs courage. If, in addition, he attempts to entangle the venerated art with a proposition, so much disparaged and derided by the less intelligent of our intelligentsia, as water divining, he takes a course at which the stoutest heart might quail. A famous archaeologist, at the peak of his career, who held the views which are set out in this article, did not venture to announce his heresy to the great learned societies of which he was a distinguished member. Instead, he made it to our small society, knowing that sooner or later it would be investigated, but also knowing that this investigation was unlikely to take place until a time when any resulting commotion would not worry him. If he had done otherwise, he would have become involved in a controversy such as would have embittered the remainder of his life. As a result, facts of the greatest importance to archaeological research were temporarily smothered. I will now produce the evidence of M. Louis Merle. So far as I am aware, the first archaeologist to call attention to the apparent association of underground streams with prehistoric sites was M. Louis Merle of Cap d'Enac, of Eron, France. His book on the subject, Radiestes et Préhistoire, published privately in 1933, is a pattern for protagonists, short and simple, and gives nearly 40 scale drawings of sites, showing clearly the courses which are taken by the streams which he alleges are associated with the remains. Anyone able to dowse should be able to verify the statements without difficulty. 1. Burial mounds. He states that prehistoric burial mounds in France are always located in the fork caused by the junction or crossing of 2 or more underground streams, and are usually enclosed by 3 or more such streams. 2. Menhirs. These are solitary standing stones of large size, sometimes called monoliths. He says, B. that these are placed in the fork of two underground streams, which are also crossed at or near their intersection by another stream. B. That if the menas have one smooth side, then this side will face the junction, and C. That if the three streams cross at the same point, then the stone will be vertical, but if one crosses between the junction of the others and the stone, then the stone will lean away from the junction, and if one crosses beyond the junction, then the stone will lean towards the junction. 3. Alignments. He states that the celebrated stone alignments of Karnak, Morbihan, are set between roughly parallel streams, and that any branching or connection with another stream is indicated by a stone of larger size than the others. He gives a plan of Karnak, and also of linear mounds at Reilhak, Lot, where he states that the mounds follow the lines of a complex of streams. As to menas, it seems likely that many such supposed monoliths may be solitary remnants of former stone circles or of burial chambers. If menas were, in fact, boundary marks, as is generally supposed, they would be more likely to be placed at the exact intersection of the streams rather than at some distance away. The leaning of the stones and the alleged smooth sides could be due to age or other causes. In a later book, Les Sources et les Monuments Mégalithiques by Charles Diot, published privately, 1935, the author confirms M. Merle's observations. He becomes mystical and adds little that appears to be useful. Captain F. L. M. Boothby, R.N. In 1935 a similar discovery was made, apparently quite independently, by Captain F. L. M. Boothby, C.B.E., R.N., a member of the British Society of Dowsers, who contributed a short article on the subject to the Journal of the British Society of Dowsers, Volume 2, page 115. Captain Boothby was interested in the water supplies of the great prehistoric camps existing in many parts of the country. Some of these would need 5,000 men or more to defend them, and with the men would be their families and animals. Such a congregation would be likely to need about 10,000 gallons of water a day to keep them alive. Few of these camps show any surface indications of wells, and the usual explanation given is that they relied upon dew ponds. To anyone with knowledge of the possible supplies from dew ponds, such an explanation is absurd. Others allege that sieges, contrary to historical records such as the Siege of Troy, etc., were unknown in those times, and that warfare consisted in a short sharp attack, after which, if it failed, the attackers presumably called it a day, and went off home. There is no reason to suppose that our ancestors had less common sense than we have, and it must have been obvious that, having got their enemies onto the top of a high hill on which there were no adequate water supplies, all they had to do was to wait until the defenders were thirsty enough to surrender. It is unlikely, also, that the defenders would have put themselves into such a position. They must therefore have made wells, and all that is necessary to prove it is to dig until they are found. Some wells have been found, for example at Maiden Castle, and Aubrey states that a spring existed within the Badbury Rings. The difficulty in finding these wells is largely due to the ancient method of storing grain. This was in pits, belling out as they got deeper, dug into the earth. In some camps hundreds of these pits have been found, and the reason suggested for this large number is that fungi made it impossible to use them more than once or twice, as otherwise the grain would spoil. The surface indication of such filled-up pits cannot be distinguished from those of filled-up wells. Captain Boothby states that in pursuit of information on this matter, he called on the curator of the Dorchester Museum, and found him excavating a tumulus. He proceeds as follows: having a rod with me, I tried it on the tumulus and found a spring run through its center. I followed up the clue, and have now tested tumuli of every type, including the long barrows, and find that they are all over springs. The long barrows mostly lie in a direction northeast to southwest, and the springs run the full length. Several tumuli are often sighted on one spring. He then investigated Stonehenge. There it was found that a spring runs right through the ruins, under the altar stone, slaughter stone and heel stone, and away down the avenue, where I have yet to follow it up. As regards Silbury Hill, the enormous artificial hill which has been excavated on several occasions without result, several springs cross beneath it. He asked that other dowsers would make experiments to confirm his observations, but apparently none did so. In Water Divining by Theodore Besterman, page 93, the author quotes a letter to him from Captain Boothby, dated March, 1937, in which he says, "The most interesting work I have done in England was in connection with tumuli and ancient monuments. It was found that all tumuli tested have been erected over springs. Stonehenge and Woodhenge are also on an elaborate system of springs. It seems probable that this has some religious significance. Plans of the system of springs on part of Salisbury Plain are with Colonel Bell and the curator of Salisbury Museum, if you require them." It is a pity that Captain Boothby, in common with some other dowsers, refers to underground streams as springs. A spring is the place where an underground stream emerges. This is, however, a minor point, and his contribution to the subject is great. 1. His statement that barrows are located over underground streams anticipates and agrees with that of later observers. 2. He states that in the case of long barrows these streams usually run their full length, in other words, that they are aligned upon them. And, 3. That several barrows are often sited on one spring, which explains the straggling lines of round barrows so often found on Salisbury Plain and elsewhere. Reginald Smith. All those who have made a study of antiquity are familiar with the name of Reginald Smith. He was a famous archaeologist, author of many papers on the subject, and the leading authority on prehistoric implements. His reputation was worldwide and extended wherever prehistory was studied. He is still quoted as an authority. For many years he was keeper of the British and medieval antiquities at the British Museum, and was director of the Society of Antiquaries. He was a somewhat dour and reserved Lancastrian. He did not suffer fools gladly, but could be most kind and helpful to a student who, before asking questions, had taken the trouble to learn something about the subject, a rare circumstance. He retired from the museum in 1938, and died on the 18th of January, 1940. He was not a man likely to put forward any important proposition, on his own special subject of prehistory, unless certain of the grounds for his conclusions. Towards the end of his career he began to take less interest in his formerly beloved flints, partly owing to the continual empty contradictions which are a depressing feature of modern archaeological research, and partly, no doubt, owing to the fact that this part of archaeology appears to be at stalemate, all possible useful information likely to be squeezed from such objects having already been extracted. He began, therefore, to turn his attention to a wider aspect of prehistory, and to explore phenomena which he had noticed on his many visits to prehistoric sites in this country. His observations of these phenomena were the subject of a lecture given by him to the Society on February 15, 1939, which was published in the Journal of the British Society of Dowsers, Volume 3, page 348. He prefaced his remarks with words to the effect that he had no expectation that what he had to say would be accepted by archaeologists for a generation. The following are quotations from his lecture. Every religion has a special use for water. Long barrows are not necessarily watermarks, as consecrated sites on account of underground water. Not Grove Long Barrow. In the middle of its long axis was a domed chamber with a burial on its floor and a blind spring exactly at the center. Wayland's Smithy, Berks, is on the same principle. The Rollright Circle has a central blind spring. The next cases form a group of earthworks on the same general lines, as Rollright. All of them have blind springs in the exact center and were therefore holy places. They can be classed as temples. Arborough, Derbyshire, the Stripple Stones of Blissland, Cornwall, Burrington Combe Gap, Somerset, the Thornborough Rings, Yorkshire, Figsbury near Salisbury, Mayborough and King Arthur's Round Table, near Penrith, Mornbury Rings, Dorchester. He also mentioned blind springs at Stanton Harcourt, Oxon, and Long Meg and her daughters, Little Salkeld and 4 at Avebury. As to Stonehenge, precisely at the centre, a few feet in front of the altar stone, is a hidden spring from which flow 3 streams. Woodhenge, in the centre of a blind spring, is revealed by dowsing, and from it flows 2 streams northward, threading their way between, not under, the closely grouped sockets. The Sanctuary, near Avebury, dowsing reveals a blind spring in the centre. The constant presence of underground water at the exact center of these earthworks and circles is a significant feature easily verifiable by others in the field. If this be allowed as intentional, the selection of sites for consecration no longer appears arbitrary, but dictated largely by geological conditions. M. Merle's observations as to French prehistoric mounds differ from those of Mr. Reginald Smith and Captain Boothby in this country. Both of the latter state that sacred sites here are situated directly over streams, and not in the fork of converging streams. If M. Merle's statements are verified, it would appear that the prehistoric religion in France differed in this respect from that in this country. All of them agree, however, that such sites in both countries are located at places where peculiar complexes of underground streams exist. My observations. A few years ago I made investigations into some of the alleged phenomena of dowsing, with a view to separating them into flocks of reliable sheep and unveracious goats. Included in these tests were the observations of Boothby and Smith. I visited a number of ancient sites for this purpose and found that their statements were confirmed in all cases. Sketch plans of some of the sites visited are given in the illustration. Long Barrow S. Lugbury, Littleton, near Chippenham, Wilts. This is a characteristic long barrow, about 180 feet by 75 feet. It has a clear example of a blind spring in its east end, over which the primary burial chamber has been erected. It is also interesting for being a line D-W over parallel streams, running its full length, a feature found in several other barrows. Most of the transverse streams, of which there are many, have been omitted for clearness. As to the 4 secondary burial chambers on the south side, the most easterly one is crossed by 4 streams. The other 3 are practically free from streams, although surrounded by them. See Merle's observations as to barrows in Brittany. Secondary chambers are unlikely to be earlier than the primary, and are usually later. Many of the Bronze Age invaders, who supplanted the Neolithic people in this country, came from Brittany. Only the primary chamber is now visible, and the remains consist of 3 stones, standing about 7 feet above ground. One of them is 12 feet long. A measured survey of the site has been made, showing all streams. Lanhill Barrow, near Chippenham, Wilts. This is an unusual long barrow, as the primary chamber is in the middle of the mound and not at the east end, as is more usual. The blind spring is clearly seen. Most of the transverse streams are shown, and the parallelism, irregular spacing and difference in angle suggests that they are rock fissures caused by seismic waves coming from at least 2 directions. Rough survey by pacing only. Mertree, near Frome. This site appears in the ordnance map as stones, but has the appearance of being a much damaged long barrow. The blind spring is clear. It has 2 standing stones over the center of the spring. One of these is 9 feet above ground. Surveyed by pacing. Buckland, near Frome. Blind spring is clear. Rough survey by pacing. Stony Littleton, near Wellow, Somerset. This is the finest example of a chambered passage grave long barrow in this country. The parallel lengthwise streams are clear, and there appear to be several blind springs with centers between these streams. The barrow is aligned upon the parallel streams, which lie northeast to southwest. Carefully surveyed by measurement. Some unimportant streams omitted for clearness. Scale plan available, showing all streams. Hetty Pegler's Tump, Ely, Gloucester, a very fine example. Of chambered barrow. Superficial survey only. A blind spring. Appears to be located at the center of the cluster of burial chambers. Bed and Bolster, Road, Somerset. This site is almost destroyed, but some stones remain. It is given because of the two lengthwise streams. Appears in the ordnance map as burial ground. Rough survey only. Gatcombe Lodge, Long Barrow. Stream traverses two burial chambers. Not completely surveyed. Winterbourne Stoke, Long Barrow. Not illustrated. This barrow is about 300 feet long and about 15 feet high, built of chalk. It is about 11 miles southwest of Stonehenge. It is aligned on two parallel streams running southwest to northeast, and has a blind spring with about 10 radiating streams under its northeast end, which is the larger. It is very similar to Lugbury. Jugg's Grave, Farley, not illustrated. This is a newly discovered barrow, of the end of the Stone Age or beginning of the Bronze Age. A central primary burial chamber, or cist, was found containing skeletons. In the body of the mount, outside the cist, there were a number of secondary burials in the manner peculiar to the late Stone Age, Neolithic period. The primary cist was enclosed within streams, but not crossed by any. The other burials were all at points where streams intersected. This barrow is surrounded by a number of enclosures, amounting to about 15 acres, which are themselves bounded by long mounds, usually called Celtic field divisions. These were possibly originally stone walls. These enclosures are remarkable, as they do not appear ever to have been ploughed, but to have been left derelict since the site was finally deserted and allowed to return to forest. In these enclosures the courses of the streams after leaving the barrows are marked by large stones set at intervals in, and level with, the ground, and particularly at any intersections. In some cases these stones extend for a distance of over 100 yards. Surveys are being made, and I hope to publish the results shortly. The other barrows on the site exhibit similar peculiarities, and are now being excavated and surveyed. All are on blind springs. Circles. Woodhenge. This is an ancient temple, and originally consisted of a number of concentric circles of wooden posts. It is generally supposed to be older than Stonehenge. It was discovered from the air in 1925 by squadron leader in Saul, VC. It is one of the most important of modern discoveries, and an example of what may result when new methods are applied to old subjects. It has been fully excavated, and concrete stumps mark the position of the old post holes. The 60 stumps of the outer ring make it easy to survey and to check the streams shown. There are two blind springs, one under the center and the other under the grave near the center. In the grave the bones of a child were found. There are 20 radiating streams, and about the same number of transverse streams. The latter are not shown in the drawing, for reasons of clearness. A survey has been made. Stonehenge. The complication of the streams here is extreme and cannot be shown in a small illustration. Only the principal streams, observed on a casual visit some years ago, are shown, therefore. It has now been more fully surveyed, but by pacing only, and a scale plan prepared. There are about 30 radiating streams and a large number of transverse fissures. There are two blind springs, one under the altar stone, and another a few feet in front of it, in the center of the circles. It will be noticed that a stream passes under the two station stones, C and D, and under the center of the circle, and leads on to the barrow about 150 years east of the monument. This barrow is located on crossing streams, as is usual with round barrows. The heel Stone H is also on crossing streams, as shown. One stream, not shown, appears to connect the heel stone with stone D and another to run from it to the barrow within the circle. The immense number of fissures here make it difficult to follow and record the exact course of particular streams, especially the transverse streams. The radiating streams are more easy to follow. round barrows. I have so far examined only one group, that at Winterbourne Stoke, on Salisbury Plain, near Stonehenge. Here there are about 20 barrows. The centres of all of those examined were at points where several water-bearing fissures cross, and all barrows appeared to be connected to each other by streams. About 10 of them are in an almost straight line, from the Long Barrow, in a northeast direction, and all these appear to be on one stream and at points where other streams cross it. I was told, locally, that another dowser had surveyed this and other nearby groups, presumably Captain Boothby. Boundary stones and miscellaneous. It is often impossible to say from visual evidence only whether any large single standing stone, called menas or monoliths, is or is not a solitary remnant of some larger structure. It is generally accepted, however, that where they do exist they are boundary marks, similar to the stone pillars known as Hermae in Greece. All ancient stone boundary marks that I have found have been related to underground streams. The Three Shires stones, on the Foss Way, 5 miles north of Bath, were erected, or re-erected, about 100 years ago on an older site. They are on the crossing point of 3 streams, one of which crosses the road at right angles and the others diagonally south of it. The Long Stone, Minchinhampton, Gloucester. This stone is said to run round the field at midnight. It is also said that if children are passed through a hole that is in it they will be cured of rickets. It is on a blind spring, and is probably the remains of a burial chamber. Barthford Hill, Bath. There is a footpath along the top edge of the Avon Valley, running from the Dry Arch about 1 mile beyond Barthford and 5 from Bath. It leads past a tower called Brown's Folly, and then bends east towards Box. It runs for about a mile. On the east side of this path there is an old stone wall, which marks the boundary between Wiltshire and Somerset. In this wall are set, at irregular intervals, large stones, half buried in the earth. Other large stones are in the open west of the wall. There are about 20 of these stones, many of which are shown on the 6 inches ordnance map. Each marks an underground stream. This is a lovely walk, 500 feet above the river and overlooking 3 great valleys and the city of Bath. It is well worth a visit, apart from its dowsing interest. Similar walls exist, a few miles away, at Whalley and Freshford, also on the boundary. I hope to deal more fully with boundary marks in a future article. Archaeological dowsing. It will be noticed that at Woodhenge and Stonehenge many more streams were found than were reported by Boothby and Smith. I use, however, rods more suitable for indicating the weaker reactions than they used, and would recommend others to use sensitive rods for this purpose so as to get all the streams. With such rods the centers of stream bands can be located within a few inches. A good rod can be made from 2 knitting needles and a piece of wire, and is described elsewhere in this issue. If a twig is used I would recommend one of thin whalebone. There are over 30,000 barrows in this country. L. V. Grinsell, The Ancient Burial Mounds of England, p. 1, so that there is ample scope for those wishing to test these things. There are also numerous stone circles, dolmens, etc., at all of which the characteristics described should be present. Generally speaking, all rock formations in this country, especially the limestone and the chalk, are much fissured by seismic disturbances. The fissures are roughly parallel with each other and at right angles to the direction of the seismic waves causing them. If they are water-bearing, the courses of these fissures can be traced easily by dowsing. They can be distinguished from what the dowser calls parallels by the fact that they are not at equal distances apart. In surveying some of the sites mentioned, these parallel reactions were very noticeable, and seem to indicate that all the streams are in rock fissures. It is significant that the great majority, if not all, of sacred sites in this country are located where a rock subsoil, usually limestone and chalk, exists near the surface. It is difficult to imagine how a blind spring could exist, and persist, in any other than a rock formation. Substantial underground streams are seldom near the surface. In the limestone district, with which I am most familiar, the depth to water is usually over 100 feet. There are, therefore, no surface indications. The primary facts of dowsing are not universally accepted and are sometimes denied strenuously by people who have made no proper investigation into them. The task of anyone wishing to put forward any proposition involving dowsing is therefore made doubly difficult by some dowsers, who make assertions of apparently miraculous phenomena, of which they may have heard or read, but which they have not tested properly. When put to the test, they fail. They thus disprove their own cases, bring dowsing into disrepute, and create a body of opponents among the very people whose opinions are most respected, and who could be the most valuable in establishing the facts. A good example is the following incident. When I first became convinced of the truth of Reginald Smith's theory, I thought it wise to look round for an expert archaeologist who was also an expert physicist. Such a man should be capable of reliable judgment on both subjects. At last I found such an individual, and wrote a tactful letter. He replied in a most friendly way, but said that he could not accept the alleged facts of dowsing. His reasons were that some years previously a well-known dowser visited his excavations, and, among other things, claimed that by the use of colored rods he could indicate the presence of buried metal objects. The dowser said that violet-colored rods would indicate bronze. He proceeds, to put his claim to the test, I excavated in his presence several large and deep holes, where he claimed bronze existed. No evidence was forthcoming, and he finally agreed that his claims could not be substantiated. A valuable recruit was thus lost to dowsing, and a weighty opponent created. I have done my best to state the facts in such a way that they can be proved or disproved indisputably. I have little expectation that, even when proved, they will be generally accepted by archaeology for many years. The attitude of the pundits is reminiscent of that ascribed to Dr. Joet, under whose portrait an undergraduate wrote the affectionately scoffing inscription, "I am the master of this college. And what I don't know is not knowledge." The facts, however, are so strong that, in the end, like the Darwinian theory, they cannot fail to be generally accepted. Sooner or later, some broad-minded antiquary, with weight on the councils of the mighty, will investigate the facts set out here, and will bring them to the notice of his brother dignitaries in so persuasive, or compelling, a manner that some will accept them. Such a storm will then arise among the archaeological teacups as will, I think, be long remembered. To be continued.